So this is the May NGN seminar, and it will be given by Keshav, who has just disappeared off the screen for a second and needs no introduction. He used to be in Waterloo before and now is in Cambridge, and looks like it's a new research direction, bringing trust to carbon credits through computer science. So over to you, Keshav.
Thank you so much, Nishant. It's a pleasure for me to be at the NGN seminar. This is work I'm going to talk about. This work is with colleagues at Zoology and Plant Sciences at the University of Cambridge, Andrew Bamford at Zoology, David Coombs at Plant Sciences, Anil, who many of you know, is also in the computer lab, and Tom Swinfield, also in Zoology. And we've been working together for the last year or so on bringing trust to carbon credits through computer science. I'm going to try and explain the systems aspects of that in this talk. So we are facing, as a world, two crises today. The climate crisis, we all, or many of us know about. Climate change is not something that's happening in the distant future, it's happening today. 50 degrees centigrade temperatures in British Columbia and Canada, fires in Los Angeles, Australia, floods in Germany. These are daily news occurrences, so we already know about that. Another crisis is in biodiversity, with up to 90% loss of marine mammals, 70% loss in insects, and 90% loss in wetlands. So there's a huge problem in biodiversity as well. There's something called nature-based solutions, which are essentially approaches of working with nature to solve simultaneously both the climate and the biodiversity crisis. For example, if you take peatlands renewal, that's something that's happening near Cambridge in the Fens. You are trying to re-wet the peatlands, and by doing so, you can sequester carbon in the soil, so drawing down carbon from the air, from the atmosphere. At the same time, it also increases the biodiversity in the peatlands. And the same thing is true for planting mangroves, the rewilding agricultural land, which is official UK policy already, and the reforestation and so on. So, and forest conservation, it is not cutting down existing forests. So that's great. And these nature-based solutions are attracting a lot of attention, a lot of funding. And the way that funding happens for them is the follows. So in the middle, I'm showing you what's called a project polygon. That's the surface of the earth with showing a project area. So let's say you decide you will protect all the forests in that polygon over there. And you create a project for doing so. So you're doing something additional. There's something doing additional over and above what's happening naturally. So what you do is you go to these organizations such as Gold Standard and Vera, which set the standards for what you need to do, you know, how much, what work you need to do, and also the auditing of the efforts. And then they create these reports, very big reports. You can go download them from their website, 80, 100-page reports, which talk about four things: additionality, leakage, permanence, and core benefits. And I'll touch upon them briefly now and go back to them later. So additionality means you're doing something over and above business as usual. So you can't just draw a polygon in the Amazon and say, pay me, but you know, you have to prove that what you've done is over and above what would have happened without your intervention. Leakage means that you're doing something, when you do something, you're causing problems elsewhere. So nothing gets cut down in your forest, but your neighboring forest, it does get cut down. That's leakage. Permanence means how long does your benefit last? And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. And core benefits are things like biodiversity, social justice, and livelihoods, which are things we care about when creating a project. For instance, I can protect a forest by throwing out all the indigenous people in there and saying you're not allowed to enter the forest anymore. And that would be very bad for, it would be good for carbon, but it would be very bad for social justice. So we want to avoid things like that as well. So all this sounds like a great idea in terms of funding through carbon credits, because what happens is these standards bodies will say, you have sequestered so many tons of carbon, let's say 1,000 tons of carbon. Each ton of carbon that you sequestered that has been drawn down from the atmosphere into the trees is a ton of carbon that would normally have not been drawn down. And so somebody who's emitting carbon can buy this carbon ton from you and pay you money for it. And typically you pay anywhere from between $5 a ton to $1,000 a ton, depending on various things. But let's say you sequester 1,000 tons of carbon a year, you're getting a $5,000 a year income stream, which you can use to protect your forests. So that's basically how the carbon credit market works today. Unfortunately, there's a lot of problems with this. So we have these carbon credits being created, but on the basis of essentially reports by people who come down into the ground, estimate things, and they can only see a few things, and they can't see exactly what's going on. And so it's been a lot of fraudulent claims on carbon credits, double counting of the same credit over and over again. And so there's been actually quite a bit of backlash because people don't really trust these carbon credits are doing what they're supposed to be doing. For instance, if you were to fly today, when you buy an airline ticket, there's often a box that says offset my carbon. You have to pay a certain number of pounds, 5 pounds, 10 pounds for a flight. It's supposed to offset the carbon. But if you look into what projects are being funded with that money, the amount of information there is quite minimal. And it's not obvious that the money is being used to do any good purpose at all, as these articles show over here. Companies, Scientific American, Bloomberg, credible sources are basically claiming that these credits are not very good at all. So these credits that have come out from existing paper-based processes are hard to quantify, they're hard to verify and hard to scale. And this really is becoming a problem considering that there's a lot of money that's coming into these credits. So there's something called ESG funds, where E is environment, as a social, G is governance. So these are funds which promise to invest in companies which have good credentials in environment, social, in society and governance. And for example, in 2021, they raised $1.7 trillion. That's trillion, not billion. And that's up 50% over the year. And so all this money, even if 1/5 or 1/6 goes into environmental protection through carbon credits or offsetting through carbon credits, it's still hundreds of billions of dollars. And those hundreds of billions of dollars are being channeled into not very good carbon credits. So there's a real need to bring trust into carbon credits so that the people on the ground, the indigenous societies, the project owners who are protecting these forests or replanting trees, they get the benefit of the money that's flowing to these funds. So what we've done to help this is to set up the Cambridge Center for Carbon Credits. So the people I mentioned, so Andrew Bamford, David Coombs, Anil, myself, and Tom Swinfield, the 5 of us are the co-founders of the Center for Carbon Credits. And our goal is to establish a global framework to issue trusted carbon credits that finances independently verifiable and accountable nature-based solutions. And so, there's a lot of things to unpack over here, and through the course of this talk, hopefully it'll become clear what these words mean. But for now, I'll just say that we're calling this 4C for short, so it's the CCCC, it's basically what we're talking about. So what do we mean by framework? So this is in short what we're trying to do. So we start with trusted primary observations. One of the biggest problems we have with nature-based solutions is that we need to trust somebody that something is happening, but we can actually observe the Earth from space. We can see it through satellites, through planes, through drones, things like that. So if you can take these trusted primary observations, can we use image analysis, artificial intelligence to come up with what we call counterfactual reasoning and algorithms, which have been peer-reviewed, so other people have proved the algorithms. On this basis, we can create carbon credits, which can then be trusted because these credits are backed by both algorithms and observations. So contrast it with the current approach, where essentially a consultant, flies to, I don't know, Gabon, and spends a week there, writes up a report, uploads it to PDF, sticks it somewhere and says, I wrote this report, trust me, to saying, look, here is what it looks like from space. Here are the algorithms. Go check for yourself that these algorithms are doing the right outputs, and therefore these credits can be trusted. And once these trusted credits are created, we can put them onto a decentralized marketplace where people can buy these credits. And because we do the marketplace using a blockchain, we can also make sure that there isn't double counting going on. And then based on the outcomes that are happening, we can go back and say, we can give the projects guidance on what to do so as to improve their performance. So this is what the system looks like. And before I go into this, I'll pause and I'll be happy to take any questions on the overall vision before I can sort of dive more into the next level of details. So if there are any questions, you can answer them now. Okay, so let me move on. So here I'm going to follow those numbers in little circles. So on the left, I talked about the nature-based solutions. That's on the far left. On the right are the customers, the people buying these credits, and all the stuff in the middle is basically computer systems to bring the credits and the transfer of money. Credits go from left to right, money goes from right to left, basically. That's how it goes. So in the beginning, we had the nature-based solutions. There are projects such as mangrove plantations or protection. And so the first thing is to have this third-party verification. So somebody has to verify that the project owner, in fact, owns these projects. They're not just pointing to some random spot in the earth and saying, I own this. So that's one part that's important. Once you've got that part done, which is a one-time cost, then we want to have these trusted primary observations based on satellite observations or crowd sensing using mobile phones or even just meters. Of course, we need trusted meters. But once we have those observations, we put all those observations into cloud storage, and a hash of the observations is put onto the blockchain. And this allows the observations to be kept in bulk storage. And the hash allows us to make sure that there is no tampering of the primary observations. And then the analytic engines, which are looking at the data, come up with essentially analysis which indicate the number of credits that should be created, and then those are put back onto the blockchain as essentially tokens or certificates, and then those tokens are again being used in the blockchain to create a marketplace where people can buy tokens, and in the end can sort of bury them, which means they can't be used anymore. At that point, the offset has matched the emission. So as you can see, this is a fairly complex system, and the blockchain sits at the heart of it, where it's keeping track of the ownership of a certain polygon on the Earth's surface by a particular project owner. That's on the arrow on the top left. And the bottom, it also holds the hashes of the primary observations to make sure that the observations are immutable. And finally, coming out from the brain picture, step number 6, it's holding the number of credits that have been allocated to a project. And so the blockchain becomes sort of central to the whole system. But there are other parts of the system which are equally interesting. And I'll get to those in just a moment. But let's just talk a little bit about the same system in a slightly different view, and sort of the flow diagram through this. So on the top left, you see the project beneficiaries. These are the native indigenous tribes in the Amazon who are protecting some forests and preventing deforestation happening, for example. So these people empower a project creator. So the project creator could be themselves. It could be somebody who is sufficiently savvy about creating carbon credits to create the project. And the project creator essentially is certified using 2 oracles. One is the KYC oracle, know your customer oracle, who says, yes, you are in fact the owner. And then the project oracle is essentially doing a project valuation, a quantitative valuation of the project to see how many credits that project has been created. And this happens annually. So the project oracle operates on an annual basis. It could be more faster or slower, but roughly speaking around that time. And this creates project tokens, which are then put onto the blockchain. At that point, when an auction happens and the project tokens are sold, the buyers get the tokens and the money goes to the project beneficiaries directly. So it cuts out sort of the middlemen. Right now, the project creation and certification can take anywhere from 50 to 80% of the eventual purchase price. We'd like to reduce that way down to 10%, 15%, something like that. We don't have precise numbers, but certainly we feel 80% is way too much. Much more should flow to the project beneficiaries. And then the buyers eventually say, okay, I emitted so many tons of carbon, I bought these credits, and I'm going to bury these tokens at that point and zero emission. So that's what was meant by net zero. And in fact, in the UK, for example, in 2050, about 8 gigatons, 8 billion tons of carbon credits will need to be purchased in order for UK to meet net zero by 2050. So the UK will still be emitting 8 gigatons of carbon, but that'll be 8 gigatons. And if you talk about just the numbers, 1 ton of carbon is going to set you back, let's say 10 pounds. That's $80 billion flowing from just the UK alone. So that's the magnitude of the numbers that we're talking about over here. These are in the tens of billions of pounds per year. It's an example of what a purchaser GUI might look like. This is a mock-up that we did where you're showing the partner's name, what project they have, and we're looking at the biodiversity benefit, the livelihood benefit, the local benefits, what the carbon credit status, etc. So this is just a mock-up, and it just shows you the kind of thing that you say. It's like you go to a shopping cart to Amazon. People that go to the shopping cart to this GUI and say, well, I'd like to buy so many tons of carbon from this project, and click on it, and then in the back end everything happens in the blockchain, and we make sure that there's no double counting. Okay, so the first project we're doing, just to kind of make sure that this methodology works well, is we're looking at using satellite imagery for trusted primary data, and we're looking purely at prevention of deforestation. So basically, we want to make sure that the forests are still there. And this is something that we can observe from space easily. So if you cut down the forest, then the Earth observation satellites from agencies such as NASA and the European Space Agency can detect that and say that, well, you cut that forest down so you don't get any credits. Or alternatively, if the forest is still existing, that means you did something right. You protected the forest, therefore you should get credits. And we're using the Tezos blockchain, we'll talk about in a moment, to put these carbon credits in, and we haven't yet, sold any credits and so on. But the first project, which is still underway, is focusing purely on the nature-based solution of averted deforestation. So we're looking at the satellite imagery over here. We use deforestation detection, and for that we compute the additionality, leakage, permanence, and the co-benefits. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a moment, and then create the carbon tokens based on that. And so now I'm going to sort of dive a little bit more into what do we mean by additionality, leakage, and permanence, and how do we measure it. And again, I'll stop here and be happy to take any questions on what I said so far.
So, Keshav, very quick question about what's the role of the blockchain if we, is it simply that there's nobody that you need to trust, or if you had a, let's say I don't know, the United Nations or Glasgow said something, there's going to establish a non-profit organization, would there be any additional benefit to using a blockchain here, or
I think that's a great question. I mean, whenever somebody wants to use a blockchain, the first question should be why, because I'm a blockchain skeptic as well. So the reasons why I want to use blockchain over here are basically having to do with reasons of scale and global reach. So scale, and actually there's a couple more minor points, but the scale has to do with the fact that, these projects are global, right? So if imagine you're doing a project in Sierra Leone, if you want to go to an organization in the United Nations, it won't be worldwide. It will be based, I don't know, Geneva, New York, somewhere, right? Nairobi, I don't know, pick a place. It's going to be based there. So you have the entire process of going through usually very human-based processes to get certification and so on, right? So the United Nations has not exactly become very digital in the last many decades. Their processes are still very cumbersome, very, very paper-based. So we are in fact talking to organizations, not the UN, but UN-like organizations, to provide some of the technological skills that they lack to help them in this process. But I mean, so scaling is one issue. The second one, again, is a very practical thing. The end project beneficiaries want payments in local currency, right? How do you do that? Because somebody's buying in dollars at one end or euros, and the other set is going to come out in some local currency. So blockchain allows you to have these multiple exchanges in a reasonable way. And then making sure that nothing is tampered with to prevent double counting in the registries. So blockchain gives you like 3 or 4 things at the same time. It gives you the certifications, the trust in the certifications, the ability to look at trusted primary observations in a tamper-proof way. And we're talking about billions of dollars, tens of billions of dollars. So there's every incentive to have fraud. So we want to also counteract that fraud. So this is, in some sense, the perfect use case for blockchain, and that solves multiple things in a way that no other system can solve.
But wouldn't you still need the exchange currency problem? Wouldn't that still exist? As in, at some point, you've got to get Tezos carbon tokens from dollars
Exactly.
or...
Yeah. So what we need are basically a multiplicity of exchanges which are willing to take fiat currencies and exchange them to crypto coins, which for Tezos and several other well-known currencies, these exist. These are already in place today.
Okay, maybe ask more questions at the end. Thanks.
Sure. Yeah, no, happy to do that. Okay, let's move on to.
Keshav, could I ask a question? A quick question.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Oh, yeah. I want to know, is there any existing system where we can buy carbon credits right now? Because I heard that some people have already bought the carbon credits. Do you know where did they buy it? Maybe the system is not as completely as yours. So
yes, you can buy carbon credits. Sure. I mean, you can buy carbon credits. If you're really into it, there's a blockchain-based carbon credit called PlanetDAO, where you can buy lots of fraudulent credits today. They'll take your money and give you fraud credits anytime you want. You can buy carbon credits from any number of places. I mean, if you just search for it, you can just say, I want to buy carbon credits. Atmosphere, which is a German company, will offset your air travel through carbon credits. You can compute how many tons of carbon you generated by taking a flight, for example, and they'll offset it for you. I don't have a list, off the top of my head, but it's very easy to find carbon credits to offset. I mean, I myself, I took a flight recently, and they said, "Would you pay 7 pounds for carbon offset?" I said, "Sure." I knew it was fraud, but I paid it anyway. So, I mean, it's very easy to get credits today. It's very difficult to find trustworthy credits. It's very easy to buy credits. Let me move on to the little bit more of the science of this, and I want to talk a little bit of additionality, which is how do you show that what you're doing is additional to what actually happens. So the way we do it is through counterfactual analysis. So this is the work that comes from our colleagues in the environmental sciences and zoology and plant science. So what I'm showing over here is sort of one area of the project, we call it the treatment. That's the one that you're protecting. And we're looking at the counterfactual, we're saying, look, in the treatment, everything is green. It's all forest. But in the counterfactual, which is a matched area, I'll come to matching in just a moment, we find that the top right corner has been deforested. So you did something right. You protected the forest, and in the counterfactual, you had this. So therefore, you subtract these two out, you got that little green. That little green thing over there is basically what you got. That's the benefit that you should get, not the whole area, but just what is over and above the counterfactual. So that's additionality. And if you look at it from a different perspective, on the x-axis, I'm showing time. On the y-axis, I'm showing the forest area or carbon stock, as we call it. And what we're showing over here is without intervention, during the project period, the total amount of carbon stock went down. That's like the top right corner went away. But with the intervention, maybe you still had some trees cut, but fewer. The rate was lower. And so the triangle, the shaded triangle, is basically the additionality that you should get. This is what you should get benefits for. This is what you get credits for. So that's additionality, basically, and shown in this way. For local leakage, there are two kinds of leakage, called local leakage and global leakage. So here we started the same thing as before, but then what we do is we create a little buffer area around the treatment area, and we find that though nothing was cut in the treatment area, but in fact was cut right outside. There was a loss right outside in the buffer area, and if you look at the difference between the two, in fact, you didn't do anything special. You just displaced the deforestation to somewhere slightly outside. So the people cutting the trees in your forest just went next door. And so you should actually get no benefit because it just leaked. You didn't prevent leakage. So that's basically what we call local leakage. And global leakage says, okay, you were fine. The counterfactual had some problems. But what happened is that you pushed your deforestation to somewhere else in the world, right? And because of this, you actually shouldn't get any credit as well because you didn't prevent deforestation overall. So this is actually pretty hard to measure. It's pretty hard to manage because what we're really saying over here is that we have to somehow see what happens. If somebody prevents trees getting cut in Brazil, maybe they cut trees in Indonesia instead. Did that happen or not? And so we, at the moment, we would like this to be able to account for this, but we don't know how to do this, and nor does anybody else, actually. It's a really tough problem to keep track of all the material flows. So here is how we represent the leakage. So here we have the same kind of graph as before. And what we're showing over here is that on the x-axis, again, I have time, y is the carbon stock. And we are showing that in the upper graph, the site A is the target project, where we've got everything additional that's nice and clean, but the counterfactual side has actually had a lot of deforestation happening. And because of this, the net leakage, so the additionality net of leakage in this case is reduced because we just displaced the deforestation from site A to site B. So that's basically what's happening over here. And now remember, we need to do all of this algorithmically and using computing and image, and we'll come to that in just a moment how to do that. Permanence is basically how long is your intervention lasting. So again, the same X and Y axes. And what I'm showing over here is that at the end of the project area, these dotted lines represent possible outcomes. So one outcome, the dashed line at the top, is saying that basically we stop deforestation at the end of the project. Somehow we managed to get people off deforestation and give them other livelihoods. And so we stopped it completely, which is great. So you had a permanent impact. The other case might be that the rate of deforestation declines, but not too much. Or on the bottom dashed line is saying that the rate of deforestation is actually the same as it was before the project started. So there was a period of time in which we reduced the amount of deforestation, but then it went back to the normal rate after the project ended because of the intervention ended. So what we want to do is, so ideally we want to be like that. We completely stop the amount of deforestation going on, but we want to value it. So how do you give a value to this temporary offset? And so the question we ask is, what is the value of temporary reduction in atmospheric carbon? And we have a paper in submission right now, which talks about it in quite a bit more detail. But the basic idea is that the net damage from releasing 1 ton of carbon is called the social cost of carbon. That's a well-known concept among economists. So what we do is to say the value of a temporary sequestration is the difference between the social cost of carbon now and the social cost of carbon at the time of release. So which is, let's say, 20 years from now. And the difference between the two is the value of temporary sequestration. So that's a very kind of a high-level explanation. I can go into it more if people are interested. But roughly speaking, this allows us to come up with the numerical value of an impermanent sequestration, which is something that is actually being hotly debated in the community right now, in the carbon credit community right now. So the last thing I want to talk about, sort of the overview level, is payments. How do we do payments? So what we do is that we want to know that something happened for sure. So we pay 1 year after the things, ex post. So we say, okay, in the past year, nothing bad happened, so we can pay you. And then we do that essentially every year ex post. And so this means that we never are projecting, we're not making payments ex ante, which means before the project happened, we only make projects. So each year ex post, we evaluate the additionality, the leakage, and then we have a computation for the expected permanence that allows us to pay for the sequestration, which gives us these very trustworthy credits. Again, are there any questions about this that I can answer? Okay, so far I've been talking sort of on the environmental science of things, and what I'd like to do now is to give you just an intuition about how this works from a geographic perspective. So here is a map, and it's a part of Africa, and what I'm showing in the bright green, the lime green, is a protected forest basically, and each of those green things is one of those little squares I talked about earlier, and what we're going to do is we're going to essentially match each of these red project areas to a counterfactual project area. And so what we want to do is to say, here's a pixel, Earth observation pixel, and I'm going to find another pixel which has the same history of behavior as this particular project pixel in terms of its land use for the last, let's say, 5 years or 10 years. And so this is basically find closest match problem. And we can use AI, we can use big data analysis to help find the best matches. And so we have a matching algorithm. This is showing you the output of the matching algorithm, which matches the project areas with the best. So we match in terms of terrain, elevation, slope, distance from roads. And distance from roads is highly correlated to probability of deforestation. So you can see it's a sort of a computer science matching problem. And then we're going to compute the leakage areas. So the light gray areas around the bright green areas are the leakage buffer zone. And then we compute the best matches for those as well. And that tells you what happens to the leakage areas. Are there any changes in those? And as I showed you earlier, the difference between what happens in the project zone versus the leakage zone gives us the additionality and the additionality over and above the leakage. And so if you take this all together, basically you can say additionality minus leakage multiplied by the level of permanence is the quantitative pricing algorithm. So we get a counterfactual corrected measure for the value of a project to society. And then we can project this into the ex-ante value of future services. And this, for the first time, really allows different nature-based projects to be compared quantitatively in terms of exactly how much additional non-leaked tons of carbon are they sequestering, and we can have essentially a trust in those computations. Because we're not just talking about it, we're showing essentially the matching pixels and all of the analysis which underlies the claim that certain amount of carbon is being sequestered in these forests. And remember, this is just the first of the projects that we're doing. So let me show you the system again, because now I want to talk a little bit more about the computer science and computer systems basis for all this. So what I've talked about so far really has basically been steps 5 and 6 in this picture over here, which is given the observations, how do we compute the additionality, leakage, and permanence, and use that to create tokens. And now I'm going to focus on the blockchain itself for just a moment, and then more about the cloud storage, which underlies all of this. So the blockchain we chose was Tezos, in part because it's energy efficient. It's a proof of stake chain. So sort of back of envelope computation is about 100 million times more energy efficient than Bitcoin. So it really is rather energy efficient. As I already answered with Nishant, it allows us to do settlement to local fiat currency for project managers through crypto exchanges. Tezos also has a self-amending chain. So it actually votes on and improves its governance periodically. And so this allows the chain to sort of self-evolve in the very same way as many countries have legislatures which allow laws to be created so that the constitution or the legal framework of the country essentially self-amends over time, in the same way that Tezos allows itself to be self-amended over time. And so countries which have this kind of governance essentially have a long-lasting governance structure, as opposed to saying, well, this is the governance, it stays the same forever, which most of the chains have. And we also can put in smart contracts of guarantees that if somebody's delivering data to the system for use for carbon credits, then they get paid, because collecting data is actually not easy. And so we'd like to make sure the data owners get a fair payment for the services that they provide. And we can do that through smart contracts. Again, that's automated in a blockchain. It would be harder to do otherwise. I see, Marvin, do you have a question?
Keshav, I have a question, if I may. Because I know there was some controversy around Tezos, which may or may not have had anything to do with the technology. And so I'm assuming it was a conscious effort, this choice of Tezos. Were there alternatives, or is it just that Tezos is so far ahead of the pack, it was the only choice?
We knew for sure we wanted a proof of stake chain. And we're looking for something for long-term survival and permanence. So I think those two, if you put those two together, Tezos was amongst the top.
Yep.
It also helps that it's an OCaml, so we can sort of rely on the integrity of the chain itself in terms of the coding. So those were some of the considerations took into account.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Okay, now I'm going to sort of dive into what's closer to our hearts in this audience, which is the system requirement. What's the system? What's really happening? So let me take a look at sort of the deeper dive into the systems end of things. So we want to support, some extent real-time data analytics, because we want to find out exactly what kind of payment somebody is going to get. If they sign up, they say, here's my project, what am I supposed to be getting? You know, I'd rather tell them in a few hours at least, or a few minutes, rather than say, wait 3 months while we figure it out. We want to do automated payments to data providers and project owners. So again, we want somebody to say, here's your project, it's been vetted, the satellite has come through, we've got the analysis done, here's your payment. You know, they don't need to go through bureaucracy to figure out how much they're going to get paid and to get paid itself. We want to vet the credit providers, these are the project owners, and also we want to vet the purchasers. Now, why is somebody buying an offset? Today, many offsets are bought by big oil companies like Shell and Exxon and so on. It's arguable that they shouldn't be allowed to buy credits. You know, they should be doing something else instead. So there is quite a vociferous lobby of people saying we should check to see who's buying offsets and have they reduced their carbon footprint first before buying offsets. You know, because offsets should be for the last resort, not the first thing you do, but the last thing you do. Of course, we want algorithms and data to be reproducible and verifiable with third parties. That increases trust in the whole system. We want algorithms to evolve over time. We want must operate globally. We don't want a single entity controlling the network because, again, single entity controlling the network means you have the possibility of corruption, given the billions of dollars flowing through. And the last one is a bit weird, but we know that projects can affect local livelihoods. We want the livelihood people who might be affected to whistleblow anonymously. So that's more of a concern about the impact on local people. I'm going to briefly touch upon how we think we can solve these problems. So for real-time data analytics, we just want to use an off-the-shelf solution, basically machine learning at scale using cloud containers, so we can do that. For automated payments to data providers and project, I think digital IDs and smart contracts allow us to do that. To vet, we basically store on-chain who bought them, who bought the credits, who sold the credits, so all the transaction history is on-chain using these purchaser IDs and digital IDs. To make the algorithms and data reproducible, we store algorithm and data hashes stored on the chain. So again, we know exactly which algorithms are being used. And the algorithms are versioned when the token metadata, so you know which version of the algorithm was used to compute a certain amount of carbon credits. We use a blockchain to get global operation and no single entity controlling the network. And then the last one, it's a research problem. So if somebody wants to work on it, it's not exactly a core problem, but still an important one. And so we can look at that. I want to talk now about a little bit about the data management. So I've kind of just talked about trusted primary observations in a very light way, but these are actually quite significant. Just to give you a sense of this, one of the data sources we use is it's called the JEDI data source. It's a laser beam operating on the International Space Station. Actually, it's 8 laser beams on the International Space Station, which are fired, I believe, 200 times a second. Every 5 milliseconds, they're shooting the beam down and they come back. And then the beam, you get back to basically 100 floating point values every 5 milliseconds from eight beams. And it's been operating for the last 4 years. So this is many terabytes of data, right? And if you want, and this allows us to compute forest heights and deforestation. So we want to essentially use this data. NASA puts it away, makes it available to use, but you're talking about petabytes of data essentially coming just from JEDI. But there's also Sentinel, there's MODIS, there's Landsat, and more and more satellites are going up. There's a new satellite called Biomass that's going to go up from the European Space Agency sometime, hopefully this year. So we talk about essentially petabytes of data being generated, which all will be useful for us to evaluate carbon credits. So we need to ingest that somehow in some system. And in doing the ingestion, we want to be able to incorporate standard data sets like the one I mentioned, which are heterogeneous with different keys and different amounts of spatial scale and spatial resolution. We also want people to have certain data sets which are private and that are selectively shared. So a certain organization may have very high density data collected using drones that they're willing to share, but only if you pay for it. And this already exists. This company called Planet, which collects very high resolution space data, but you have to pay quite a bit for it. So we'd like to somehow have a pointer to that and say, look, we can use it, but we need to pay for it. Once we've ingested this data into our data management system, we want to interpolate missing values, upscale and downscale, and so we can use AI for doing that. And we also need to temporally and spatially slice it. So if you're only interested in the Brazilian Amazon, well, that will be a spatial slicing. If you're only interested in things that happened in the last 5 years, there'll be temporal slicing. You want to remove that. So we have a spatial temporal slicing problem that's essentially data pre-processing that we need to do. And we need to maintain it. We need to allow incremental updates. For example, NASA releases periodic updates to the above-ground biomass as they improve their algorithms. So we want to essentially ingest those. We want to maintain provenance of any derived products that are created from these that we ourselves are creating. The derived product might be additionality or the level of local or global leakage. And we want to know where did it come from? How did we derive that number so we can work backwards to find out where the primary data was? We want to make sure that a single loss doesn't cause the system to go down. So we're going to distribute that across multiple stores. And people may want to download slices for their own use. And so we want to create a REST API for downloadability. And finally, we want to archive this. We want this data to be available beyond the project lifetime, perhaps for 50 years, because if I'm going to give carbon credits, if somebody is growing a forest and it takes 50 years for the forest to mature, then the data has to be available for 50 years. And we really actually don't know how to build data archives that last 50 years very well. I mean, even the internet is just about 50 years old. We don't really know how to do this. And we need to do this reproducible computation that is reconstructible for decades at a time. So this data management problem is a hard computer science problem, a hard computer systems problem that I think we need to solve in order to provide the foundation for the overall system that I talked about. So I want to leave plenty of time for questions, so let me just conclude here. So in short, nature-based solutions address both the climate and biodiversity crisis, which is great. And so funding them through carbon credits is a great idea, but creating trust is critical because at the moment, there's a lot of problem with these credits. So they're not really necessarily trustworthy. Not all of them are trustworthy anyway. I believe that computer systems research can help solve the problem in collaboration with the environmental scientists, and that's the focus of the Cambridge Center for Carbon Credits. And I'll end with this slide, which is our website for CCST, which has more details, and we're always happy to talk to people, especially if they can help us solve our problems. So with that, I'll stop. I'm happy to take any more questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Keshav. Very interesting. I'll open up the floor for questions.
Hi, Keshav. Thank you very much for a very cool talk. I had a couple of very quick questions. So on the one hand, I was wondering, does it matter the type of forest, or there are some forests better than other ones in terms of how much carbon they can take?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'm not an expert in forests, but I talk to people who are. Our understanding is that the tropical moist forests are pretty much the best forests you can think of in terms of carbon sequestration and the amount of growth they have. So that would be Brazil, Equatorial and Central Africa, and Indonesia, Malaysia, that part of those are the three major belts where we have these kinds of forests. And so temperate forests, such as the ones in Europe, don't grow that fast. And then, of course, the enormous stocks of existing forests in northern Canada, Siberia, but luckily many of them are protected. The tropical moist forests is where a lot of these issues are.
But from the point of view of carbon credits, all the forests are the same.
Okay, so carbon credits come in two flavors. You can think of them as the reforestation, which is growing new forests, and averted deforestation, preventing deforestation. So from our perspective, for reforestation, the amount of biomass acquired in 1 year tells you how many credits you're going to get, right? So in the tropical moist forest, it's going to grow much more. It can grow about 1.5 tons of carbon sequestered per hectare per year in the Brazilian Amazon, for example. You'd have far less than that in Canada, right? So that tells you how many credits. But from the perspective of Earth observation and this whole sort of system, yes, all forests are basically equivalent because we can observe them from space, we can compute the above ground biomass, and we can assign credits to them.
Thank you very much.
Sure.
Hey, Keshav, great talk. I had a question about how you measure additionality. Is the information of which kind of parts of the forest, there's like a link between kind of, an area you care about and some area that looks very much like it, but is somewhere else. Is that information made public, or is it supposed to be hidden?
So that is exactly the matching algorithm, which will be public. So the idea is that you take a project pixel, and then like I showed you with arcs going through, so arc is going to the matched pixel, and the matching is done based on basically physical parameters, elevation, slope, distance from the road, etc., which are all quantitative parameters. So the idea is that here's a matched pixel which has the same trajectory of land use for the last 5 years, and then the land use diverged after the project started, which means that you did something in your in the project which caused that to happen. So we're assuming that that's what happened.
Does that mean that someone can look at all these areas that are matched and what's protected and find parts of forests that are sort of under the radar and then target those?
Target in the sense of deforestation, you mean?
Yes.
Well, remember that the project areas that are getting credits are being managed by a project manager, right? And so the project managers have overall responsibility. So if somebody wants to attack this in some sense, what they're going to have to do is to attack a protected area, which is what the forest managers are trying to prevent. It's in their financial interest to make sure that nobody's causing deforestation to happen in their managed area. So I'm not quite sure what the attack is exactly.
I'm not either. I'm kind of just, I want to open the floor for maybe thinking about that a bit. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah.
But I guess there's a related thing though there, right? Because it could be that the land use could change because of some local government fiat or something. But you're sort of assuming that people who would have taken, let's say, wood from this protected area are going there because it's not protected. And I guess
so let me explain a little bit about what's going on. So let's take a kind of a simple example. Like you have your backyard and you have a neighbor's backyard, and they both have 5 trees growing on them, right? And what we do is we observe for the last 5 years that you both have 5 trees growing for the last 5 years. They're matched. They're matched in terms of location, rainfall, slope, whatever. We think they should be doing, everything should be happening the same. Now, what happens is that your neighbor cuts down 2 of the trees and you don't. You protect it, right? Counterfactual reasoning says that you, if you signed up for the credit, you're saying, look, I'm going to protect my trees no matter what, and my neighbor cut down the trees because it was economically beneficial for him or her to cut down those trees, but I took the hit of not cutting the trees, so I protected them. Please pay me for protecting all the trees. And our analysis will say, yes, they cut down 2 trees, you didn't cut down any trees, you get 2 trees worth of credit. That's basically what avoided deforestation looks like. Now, it could be the case that the government legislates everybody should cut down 2 trees in their backyard, for whatever reason, there's some kind of legislation like that. Or alternatively, what happens is the government says nobody's allowed to cut down trees because we're going to stop deforestation in 2030, which is actually something that's already been proposed in COP26. If there's a legislated mandate that no tree should be cut down, no forest should be cut down, then there's no additionality for anybody, right? Because this is what you're supposed to be doing. You're not supposed to protect it. In any case, our analysis will be showing that. They will show that in your project area and in the counterfactual area, subsequent to the government edict, the trajectory of carbon stock has stayed the same. There has been no change in the rate of deforestation. It has both become 0 because that's what the government said. So we're kind of we're able to take that into account in the analysis. But that's sort of how the additionality argument works.
Yeah, I guess I was asking the flip side of it. So maybe my my neighbor is my neighbor is essentially it's a different autonomous domain, or a different government essentially, and but the leakage aspect would have been not the additionality itself, but the leakage aspect would have been somebody who would have bought my trees are now going to my neighbor and buying it.
Indeed,
But that
indeed,
makes the
exactly.
assumption that
Yes.
the buyer of the trees can actually operate across these two governments or these two
Yeah,
domains.
so when you have global
Then
leakage, like, exactly. If you have local leakage, right? If I say my buffer area includes some neighbors, etc., then it's okay. But you have global leakage, so you want to build a house, you need so many whatever kilograms of wood, and the local forests are protected. So you say, I'll buy imported wood, right? So in the end, something got deforested. So that material flow, which constitute global leakage, is really very hard to track. Now, there are some projects in place which are trying to track material flows globally, but it's really, really challenging. So at the moment, we don't have good solutions to that, but that's something which should be done. I mean, this is a known thing about global leakage, which we don't know what to do, actually.
Okay. So there's a comment in the chat that says, it sounds like the attack is to own one protected area and one matched reference area, move all the deforestation to the reference area, so the attacker still cuts down the same amount of forest. I guess this is exactly the problem of leakage that you're trying to minimize.
Yeah, so what we are doing is, if you could have a matched pixel, which was, so you did nothing until the project started, and then you moved all of your leakage to outside the buffer zone, then that would be an attack. Yes, that is true. That is true. So I think Fyodor's intuition was right over here, that if you knew the matching pixel, then you could attack that by concentrating your deforestation to that matched pixel. Now, I should add, however, that wood is heavy. If you cut down a tree to transport it to a lumber mill, is not straightforward. So as long as we're matching pixels, which are, let's say, a couple of 100 kilometers away, you're not going to go there and cut it down because there may be no roads over there, for example, or whatever. I heard a talk from some forest management person in the United States saying that if you drive if you're more than what 50 miles away, it's not worth cutting the tree because the lumber mill is in a particular location, right? The cost of moving that wood through to the lumber mill is not worth it if you move far enough away. So I guess to prevent this attack, we should make sure that our match pixels are sufficiently far away that it's not worth attacking that particular match pixel. But I think
maybe one dimension of matching should be the distance to the nearest lumber mill.
Yeah. So we do distance to road. Actually, we do have distance to road as one of the things. We don't say lumber mill, but road. But to be honest, this is an attack I hadn't thought about. So I'm glad I gave this talk because now we can think about how to defend against this attack. So that's a good one. Thank you.
I guess that one of the problems that you have is having enough satellite or drone image information, right?
Well, luckily, there's a lot of it around. I mean, there's something called Google Earth Engine, for example, which is free for academic researchers, which has many terabytes of data from all sorts of satellites available for free. So going back, Landsat time series goes back to the 1970s. It's not high resolution, but it goes back to the 1970s. Sentinel, there's Sentinel-1, Sentinel-2. These two are going around the world every 5 days, and so you can get actually quite a bit of data through there. And then there are lots of private companies which get data. So if you use Google Earth or Google Maps, the very high resolution data you see over there, which is typically 50 centimeter resolution data, is privately obtained by Boeing, Airbus. They take that. When they fly over from the planes, they also take images, of the ground. Why not? It's cheap. They just do it. And also from these retargetable satellite fleets, which you can pay this company called Planet about 12,000 euros, and you can take any part of the world 50 centimeter resolution data. They'll give it to you. And so that's where you get these war images as well.
Yeah, that's what I was actually wondering, like whether it would make sense to have like a market where you have a price for satellite data on areas that you deem of particular interest, and that is a fraction of the carbon credits that you could have. So basically, whoever would acquire those carbon credits would acquire the carbon credits minus 20%.
Yeah. yeah, what we are thinking of is that the section called private data and the smart contracts of private data. So you could say, that in order to verify this, you're going to have to pay the data owner some fraction of, of the cost so that you can do it. Part of it is that we meaning the person who certifies also needs to have access to the data. And so we haven't yet worked out exactly what the payment should be. So if the data has already been collected, then it's relatively easy for them to give it to us. It's not very expensive, they're well stored, but if it's data that has not been collected, that needs to be collected by targeting the fleet, that's the very expensive part. That's the 12,000 euro cost for collecting the actual data. But yes, so some of the costs of the data will go to the project owner and to the credit purchaser saying, well, this is cost of doing business. So that needs to be factored in somehow. But by and large, you're trying to be relying on public data put out by national space agencies, which are free and reliable, and they're not been tampered with as far as we know.
I think we are getting very close to the bottom of the hour. There's one comment in the chat. I don't know if you want to respond to that, Keshav. It says, instead of matched pixels, it's more like you want to group similar areas into a very large set, then have a distribution of outcomes, good and bad. And then you want to reward the project areas for not sliding down the distribution from the good towards the bad.
Yeah, so in some sense, that's what we do, because we compute the mean land use change in the project areas and the matched areas. But we are doing it at the moment on a matched pixel by matched pixel basis. And I think one way of avoiding these kind of attacks would be to have area by area rather than pixel by pixel. So the pixel by pixel algorithm is obviously, it's not coming from me, it's coming from our colleagues in zoology and plant sciences. I think we should go back to them and go back to the drawing board on that a little bit. I think that comment is spot on. So definitely, thank you for that, whoever it is. Thank you very much. That sounds like a good idea.
Okay, we are at 1700. So I guess if people need to leave, they need to leave. Keshav, I know you need to leave as well, but there's one, and I did say final question, but there's one other comment which is asking you to summarize the open research problems in the area. Okay. I don't know if you have a quick resource for them, or if you want to talk about it a bit more, if you have the time.
I highlighted over here sort of one big problem, one smaller problem, and then the new problem that showed us. And the big problem is, how do we get a data management system, really a system that lasts 50 years? How do we build a computer system that lasts 50 years? The data lasts 50 years, the algorithm lasts 50 years, algorithms are versions. So the data management system has showed that we underlies all of this is something that at least I don't know how to build. And I don't think anybody has thought in these terms in the computer systems literature that I'm aware of. Nobody puts in a requirement to last 50 years or 100 years. So we want to do that. That's a big problem. There's a smaller problem of that anonymous whistleblowing. That's sort of a digital ID credentials, sort of dithering anonymity type problem that I'm hoping some master's student will solve for me at Cambridge. It's a smaller problem. And then there's matching, how to avoid attacks on matching. I think that seems to be another problem over here. But more broadly, what I'm trying to motivate here is the fact that we can use our skills as computer scientists, computer systems people, to attack something well beyond what we normally think about. We normally think about improving the speed of the internet, or I don't know, improving the transactions per second in some database system. That's all well and good, but there are really critical problems that are facing the world today. As I said, the biodiversity, the climate crises. Anything that we can do to help is something that's super important. We don't have that much time left. We have to make dramatic changes by 2030 and existential societal changes by 2050. This is in the lifetime of everybody on this call, pretty much. There is no time to waste. If you can't find a problem to work on, you aren't paying attention. It's as simple as that. It's like somebody falling on the edge of the cliff and saying, what problem should I work on now? You're falling on the edge of the cliff, my friend.
Yeah, climate change, yes. Yeah, that sounds like a good note to end on. And so thanks so much, Keshav.
Thanks so much. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye.